Hey everyone, I've done some videos since the election about different ways that we can support marginalized communities who are especially going to be affected under this new fascist regime that we're entering. I did a video about how we can protect and support women of reproductive age. I did a video about supporting our LGBTQ friends. And today I want to do a video about how we can support our Black women, our Black sisters. I'm Carolyn. This is my channel called As I See It, where I talk all things politics. I do also have an RV life channel, but this is where I talk about the things that I am passionate about. And today I want to talk especially to my white sisters, white women, and share what I'm hearing online and how we can support our Black sisters. And I'm not gonna lie, I'm feeling a little emotional. This has been a really difficult video for me to think about making. I've been wanting to make it. I've been wandering around the desert, talking it through. I want to make sure I get it right. I want to make sure I don't cause more harm. I know that Black women are really hurting right now. I know that you're feeling extremely abandoned and hurt and angry. And I'm seeing that from women, all the Black women I follow pretty much across the board. I'm seeing that. And I don't want to make it worse. I don't want to make this about me. But I feel like this is an extremely important video to make to help white women understand your history, your abandonment, your anger, and to help us do better. And this is coming from a woman, this trepidation I'm feeling about making this video comes from someone who I thought sorry, that was Sadie, is coming from a woman who I thought I was pretty comfortable talking about race. I've had a lot of Black friends. I've said this before, I've had friends across the rainbow, both in color and denomination and nationality, as well as the rainbow, LGBTQ. I've had a lot of experience with Black people. I've sat at dinner tables. They've sat at my dinner table. I have had groups of friends where I have been the only white person in the group. So I have learned, I've heard the stories, I know the experiences, and honestly, I have made mistakes. So I recognize also, but I think that might be a video for another day, talking about our often discomfort in talking about race. We're afraid we're going to screw up. We're afraid of being vulnerable. I think on our side of it, we're afraid of making it worse, or of insulting someone without meaning to. I've made mistakes on this channel, and you all have called me out, and you've caused me to do some self-reflection. When I was the only white person in my group of friends, I stuck my foot in my mouth and they let me know. So you only learn by making mistakes and allowing yourselves to be vulnerable. And I don't think anybody is going to be mad at you for trying. So today I want to talk about how we can pick up the baton from our warrior Black sisters and carry that baton in order to continue to fight for our rights and their rights. And I gotta tell you, as a woman who is a student of history, who is passionate about history, I took a race relations class at Berkeley when I was there. In preparing for this video to make sure I wasn't just falling back on things that I thought were true, I did a lot of research. I learned a lot about Black women in history. So I think this is an important video, not just for white women, but for white men as well, to understand the experience of Black women in our society so that we can be better allies. I'm emotional because I know what abandonment feels like, and to have an entire society abandon you. And I know, like, a lot of us are like, what the hell? We want to shake the white women who voted for him. But it's especially poignant for Black women, and I'm going to explain why in a minute. So I'm going to talk about 5 ways we can support Black women, not just now, but forever. These are things that I didn't necessarily think about, that maybe many of you aren't necessarily thinking about. So I'm hoping it'll help give us all a place to start and some action items that we can take. And Sadie, anybody who follows me on my RV channel, every time I turn on the camera, that food's been in her dish all morning. So pardon Sadie's crunching. All right. So the first way I want to talk about supporting Black women is, number one, we have to know the history. There's so much history I didn't know. And I've learned from many of you on this channel, and I've learned by digging deeper into the research. So let's talk about the history between white women and Black women very briefly. I'm not going to get into a huge history lesson here. I'm going to put a lot of resources and reading and links in the video description. Please dig deeper in your own time and learn this. I literally, like a year ago, 2 years ago, I did a video about voting rights, and I literally said in 1920, when the 19th Amendment passed, all women got the right to vote. A student of history, I said that, and many of you corrected me. And I still didn't dive deep into the history to fully understand it, but I have, in the last few days, I have. And let me tell you the history between Black women and white women as far as the right to vote. We all think of the women's movement for voting began at Seneca Falls with Ida B. Wells and Susan B. Anthony. That's the history we were taught, right? History written by white women. Literally. The fact is, it was a very small gathering in Seneca Falls, and it was all middle-class white women. Black women weren't even invited to the table. It was kind of an impromptu, from what I understand, gathering to discuss women's voting rights, but there were no Black women. And in fact, Black women had been organizing in their towns, in their cities, in their communities. They had been organizing for decades for the right for all women to vote. They'd already been fighting. Sojourner Truth, Ida B. Wells, they were already making names for themselves in the suffragist movement. Another thing that we were never told is that these suffragists, Katie Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, they weren't fighting for all women to vote. They were specifically fighting for white women. In fact, there was a huge movement that said Black men should get the right to vote first. Huge movement working alongside the women's movement, both Black and white women, fighting for equality, the ability for women to vote. And a lot of people were arguing white men already had the right to vote. Black men should be next. And in fact, the white suffragettes said no. And no, white women, they specifically said white women should get the right to vote before Black men. And they didn't just say it like that. They used it was a very racist rooted belief. No, we're white, so we should get the right to vote first. So this whole women's rights movement, where it was all kumbaya and white women fought for the rights of Black women, is a complete lie. Complete lie. And in fact, they were pretty racist about their belief that white women should get the right to vote first. And in fact, during the early 1900s, through to the passage of the 19th Amendment giving women the right to vote, we'll get to that in a minute, there was organizing. And in fact, in 1913, there was a huge rally of women's rights advocates for the right to vote. Ida B. Wells showed up with her coalition of women fighting for the rights of all women to vote. And do you know what the white suffragists told her and her group? Get to the back of the line. They didn't even want them marching for women's rights with them. Go to the back of the bus. Go to the back of the line. Ida B. said, no, we're not going to do that. And I don't think they really had to march in the back. But this was the mentality of the women's movement that we don't hear about. This is not what we read. I mean, if we're lucky enough to hear any women's history at all, we certainly don't hear how racist the early white suffragists were. And in fact, they were. So eventually, in 1920, the 19th Amendment was passed, which said that voting rights shall not be restricted based on sex. And the terminology of that is very specific. It doesn't say that women have the right to vote. So there are some scholars who believe that that terminology was very specific in order to continue to include black women. So women had been voting at different times in the history of this country. Over time, those rights were taken away, and white women were kind of fighting to get them back. However, when the 19th Amendment was passed, black women were voting in some states that allowed them to. California was one, and there were a couple others. So black women were voting. The 19th Amendment did give them some voting. However, what it did not address, and where the white women abandoned them, are all the Jim Crow laws in the segregationist, racist South. Black women were especially victimized by the Jim Crow literacy tests, voter ID, and the other obstacles they put up around voting. Sure, on paper, as a black woman, you can vote, but when you show up, we're going to make you jump through all these impossible hoops that we know you're not going to be able to jump through. Literacy, there was another one. Literacy, taxes, poll taxes, and voter ID, all of which were specifically geared toward excluding black people and especially black women. Because think about the role of women even back then in society. Women weren't allowed to own property. They weren't allowed to have bank accounts. So why would a black woman have ID, right? Or even be literate? Remember, this is just, 50 years after the end of slavery. So we're still dealing with the repercussions of that. So these segregationist Jim Crow laws put up obstacles to women voting, not only to black women voting. Not only that, violence, lynchings, worse, sexual assault. Women tried to, I need to keep calling out black women, were trying to go vote and they were getting assaulted, even lynched and murdered. And white women abandoned them. They did not address any of this. They were like, okay, we got ours, see ya, threw them under the bus. Literally. So black women were left fighting this fight that they had been fighting for all women. They were left to fight it on their own. And it wasn't until the Civil Rights Act of 1965 that literally did away, on paper, legally, did away with all of these obstacles and all of these Jim Crow laws that prevented black women from voting. So literally 45 years after the 19th Amendment passed, supposedly giving all women the right to vote, 1965 was literally when all women, black women, were allowed to vote. So that is the history. Let's also talk one other thing that I left out that I read. White women, in their fight for voting rights, were actually aligning themselves with Southern racist groups. Southern groups who were enforcing Jim Crow laws. They were literally kicking their black sisters under the bus. Well, they weren't their sisters because they were treating them like crap, but they were literally throwing black women under the bus and aligning themselves with the very forces that had their boot on their neck, that were preventing them not only from voting, but were literally assaulting and lynching them. White women were aligning with them in order to get their right to vote. And you might think, oh, this is ancient history. Oh, you know what? That was 1920. That was ancient history. No, it's not ancient history. When the Supreme Court overturned the Voting Rights Act, it was black women in 2020 who rallied and fought and flipped Georgia. It's black women who have been picking up the torch saying no. Because we white women have gotten complacent. We have gotten to the point, especially the ones who voted for that guy, have gotten to the point where like, oh, it's not going to happen to us. Oh, it's not going to happen to us. And I know those of us who are on the liberal side of it see it a little differently. And I'm going to get to that though in a minute. But this is not ancient history. And we all know, those of us who are aware of history and think of ourselves as students of history and understand how history impacts who we are today, the systems and the institutions in place that give us rights or don't give us rights or prevent us from living our full free lives. We understand how big of a part history is in that. In fact, everybody recognizes how important history is in who we are today. Otherwise, the victors would have been honest in writing the history books. If they didn't realize how important history is, they would have told the truth. But instead, they whitewashed it, made themselves look like the heroes and not the villains that they were. So this is just a tiny little history lesson, and it is extremely important for us to understand the history of white women selling out black women. I'm sorry, I don't know why I'm emotional. We have to know this history. And I think part of the reason I'm emotional is because I kind of took it personally. When I saw all the anger, as someone who has been vocal and as someone who has tried to listen and understand, and I think this is coming from how much I didn't understand and how much I didn't know about your experience. And I'm sorry, but I'm trying to do better. And I'm trying to, by making this video, I'm hoping to help other white women do better. So number one, how do we support black women? We learn our history. And again, I'm going to put a reading list below. Don't just take what I have said here. I hope that you will read black women's stories, hear their stories, hear the truth about history, and understand how it influences where we are today. And I'm going to dive deeper into that. Number two, knowing the history, we need to commit. We need to double down on standing strong with black women. We need to understand that when we are sitting at tables, in boardrooms, in the legislature, hopefully someday in the presidency, when we are there advocating for women's rights, we need to stop taking for granted that that means all women. We need to specifically call out, does this include black women? How do we address issues of black women? Now that we have done some research and we understand the history, we need to stand strong in their history, in their experience, their ancestral experience with us, white women. We need to not just understand it, we need to live it. And we need to dedicate ourselves. We need to commit to doing better. We don't want to be that. So we need to start inviting black women to the table. Whether that's the kitchen table, whether that's the card table, whether it's the table at the community center or the boardroom or the tables of the highest echelons of our government. We need to not just assume that they have been invited, or not just assume that if they wanted to be there, they would. We need to be proactive. If you look around the room and there are no black women, go find a black woman and invite her. And when she's there, listen to her without getting defensive, without getting angry. Just listen. You'll learn a lot. Ask them if you could be a part of their communities. Reach out to black organizations and nonprofits and community groups and ask, do you mind if I join? I would like to help. I'm here to help, period. Don't make it about you. Make it about them. Don't make it as, I'm a hero white woman coming into a black community. Make it about them. Okay? We've made enough about us. And if they say no, if you invite them to the table and they're like, and they say no, or you ask if you can help in their communities and they say no, respect that. Respect that. Just move on. They may not want a white face in their group, and that's okay. And I think this is the most important. If we are at these tables advocating for women's rights, we're a bunch of white women, we're talking about women's rights. If there are no black women at the table, we need to be their voice. We need to stop assuming that when we, as white women, are at the table advocating for women's rights, we need to stop assuming that that includes Black women. We need to proactively, vocally, outspokenly be their voice when they can't be there. What does that mean? Recognizing that historically, when we have talked about women's rights, that has not included Black women. When we talk about women's health care, it doesn't include Black women. When we talk about women in education and women in corporate America and women in politics, when we talk about it as white women, we need to recognize that that doesn't always mean it includes Black women. So we need to verbally, proactively make sure, okay, are we talking also, how do we address the Black women's issue? Okay, well, Black women's healthcare is definitely not the same as women's healthcare as far as how they're treated and the outcomes. So how do we include Black women healthcare in this conversation? Oh, don't worry, we will. No, I want to know. We need to lay out a plan. We need to start speaking up not only for ourselves, but for other people, Black women. So don't just let the group of white men or white women say, oh yeah, don't worry, we're going to cover that. No, I want to know right now. As a member of this community right now, I want to make sure what Black women are included in this. How are we going to take care of Black women? We need to be their voice when they're not at the table. And let's talk about why this is important, that we be the voice for Black women when they're not at the table. Remember also, Black women are like 7 or 8% of the total population. So it may not be possible to always have Black women represented at the tables and in the rooms that we're in. That's why we have to be advocates for them. And why is this so important? Because let's just talk about a few statistics about how Black women have been abandoned and ignored and downplayed. Black women have a lower life expectancy than white women by 77.9 years for Black women to 81 years per white women. So life expectancy, a very basic measure of how a society is doing health-wise, mental health, resources that are available to them to take care of themselves, healthy food, medications, medical care. That's like the biggest measure of how a society or a community is doing. And their life expectancy is like 3.5 years less than white women. Infant mortality for Black women, 10.9 per 1,000 births versus 4.7 for women. Maternal mortality. You ready for this? When we're talking about abortion, when we're talking about who these bans affect the most, infants die more than twice the rate of white babies per 1,000 births. Maternal mortality for Black women is 37.1 per 1,000 versus 14.7. So we can't pretend that when white women are at the table talking about women's rights, women's health care, women's access to medical care, we cannot pretend anymore that when we're there talking about women's rights, that we're talking about all women's rights. It's obvious we have left them behind. I mean, it's in black and white. These numbers prove we have left Black women behind. We need to be their voice at the table, in the community. Pregnancy-related mortality for Black women, 42.4 versus 13 for white per 1,000. Abortion bans. And I've said this in other videos. It disproportionately hurts Black women. And so many white women voted for him, for a national, probably, abortion ban. And that sends a strong message. We don't care. They're telling Black women, we don't care. I mean, they're telling all women that because white women definitely are going to die from this too, but definitely not to the extent that Black women are dying. That sends a clear and strong message. Can you imagine? No wonder they're upset. That's off 42 versus 3 per 1,000 in pregnancy mortality. 42 per 1,000 Black women are going to die. Healthcare, heart disease, hypertension, obesity, and mental health are all worse. All those measurements are worse for Black women than they are for white women. So if we as white women, are sitting here thinking we have been fighting for the rights of all women, we have. No, obviously we haven't. Obviously we haven't. Black women have been doing a lot of this work on their own, but they need our help because we've got the larger numbers, and unfortunately, we're probably listened to. We are, not probably. I mean, study after study has shown that Black women go into the doctor with pain and they dismiss it. Little Black kids are treated like adults instead of kids. We live in a racist society. And we're seeing it more now than ever. It's resurging. We live in a society that places more credibility on the lighter shade of my skin versus the shade of a Black person's skin. So we need to be advocates. This is how we support Black women and their children and their families. And the third way we can support Black women is listen to them. Actively listen. And I know I have been guilty of this even on this own channel of saying, yeah, but white women, yeah, but we, yeah, but. Okay, you know what? Yes. As women, we are all treated as second-class citizens in this freaking misogynist society. But if white women are second-class citizens, Black women are literally like fifth and sixth-class citizens. So we need to stop comparing and start listening. Actively listening. Don't get defensive. Don't say, yeah, but. Actively listen. And maybe say, what can I do to help? Some Black women are kind of tired of having to educate us, so we need to take the responsibility to educate and inform ourselves. Find ways to help without jumping on the backs of Black women even more. Educate ourselves. And you know what? If we have a question, if we really are coming from a good place and want to help, and we just say, you know what, how can I help? I don't think anybody is going to turn you down. And when we actively listen, engage with influencers online, I follow a lot of Black women online, amplify their voices, share their channels, share their pages, listen to what they're telling you and share it with your audience with a statement about why this is important for your audience to listen and to follow. So not only listening, but let's amplify their voices and support them. And make sure when you're actively listening, really listen to their stories. I learned a lot hanging out with my friends in the Bay Area, a lot about what they go through in society and the micro and macro aggressions. And, I've heard stories firsthand from my Black male friends of getting pulled out of cars and thrown on the ground by police officers. They didn't do anything. They were driving while Black. I've heard the stories from my Black female friends about the abuse and the disgusting things that men say to them and the racist remarks and their experience going to the doctors and having a white man talk down to them and act like their pain doesn't matter. I've heard these stories firsthand from people I care about. So when we start listening to their stories and how they feel, we start understanding them on a little bit of a different level, and it'll help us be better advocates. And number 4, and this is big, we need to stop being so fucking polite. Fuck polite. Fuck rocking the boat. Rock that goddamn fucking boat. I'm having this on my other channel right now. I am sick and tired of privileged groups in this country trying to shut me up and tell me how not to offend them. You know what? It's not my job to not fucking offend you. That's not my job. If you're offended, you need to take a look in the mirror. And we, as white women, need to stop being so polite. Call out racism when you see it. I just had an experience not too long ago. Literally sitting around a picnic table. Somebody, a white man, said something extremely racist. I mean, and I was just like, you know who I am. Like, these words came out of his mouth, and I just was like, you know that's extremely I mean, before I even knew what I was saying, you know that's extremely racist, don't you? Yeah, I knew. Yeah, I know. Then why did you say it? That's hurtful and offensive. Before I even knew it. I stopped being polite a long time ago. I have no filter. And we need to remember something. It may not always be safe for a black woman to call out racism. Think about that. If a white man says something racist, it may not be as safe for them to call it out as it is for us. It may not always be safe for us, so you need to be careful. But call out racism when you see it. And I'm going to put a link below to a guide, because this is my story. And when I was thinking about making this video, I was like, maybe that's not the best way to go about calling somebody out on their racism, because my therapist would say that's kind of shamey, blamey. But you know what? Fuck it. But I did do a little research about how to call out racism. And in fact, the one source that I found that I'm going to use below did say, and it's like an anti-racism website, it did say, call it out. Say, you know, that's racist, right? But there are some other ways that you might be able to approach it that might be a little softer and a little less shamey, blamey. So there is a link to that below so that you can learn. And here's what you need to do. Practice it. Don't wait until racism happens in front of you to get your spiel out. Start practicing it. Get together with a group of your white friends and practice it. You know, pretend your white friend said something racist. Practice how you're going to respond to that. What I have learned in therapy is that when I'm anticipating a difficult conversation, we go through what I'm going to say, how I'm going to handle it in therapy. She helps me, guide me through, like, that sounds shamey blamey, so maybe position it this way. And then I go and practice it on my own. And the reason practicing is so important is because it almost becomes muscle memory. And that way, in the moment, you're not caught up with emotion. You can just rely on your muscle memory. So practice how to call out racism, practice it, and call it out every freaking time you hear it or see it when it's safe. Safety first for all of us. And as far as being polite, educate and inform everyone you know. When somebody says something stupid like, black women or black people don't have it that hard. This is 2024. The racism is dead. Well, there isn't any racism anymore. Be prepared to call them out. Be prepared with, really, then why is life expectancy for black people, for black women 3 years lower than white women? And why is infant mortality so much higher? Well, they make bad choices. What makes you think it's poor choices? Plenty of white women make bad choices too. Have you considered maybe it's the health care? Maybe they're not getting the health care they need? We need to educate and inform whenever possible. And I think as white women, we need to start amplifying on our social media black women's voices in order to educate and inform our fellow sister white women. And finally, number 5, we need to be advocates for the rights of all women. And like I said earlier, we can't just go to a table assuming when we're talking about rights for women that black women are included. We need to make sure, we need to double down. Be their voice, be advocates. But that also means getting involved. We need to organize. We need to build community. We need to stop leaving this fight for women's rights to other people. Especially, we need to stop letting all of this responsibility fall on the shoulders of our black sisters. We need to female up. We need to ovary up. We need to freaking get out there and be as adamant and as vocal and as involved as black women. We can learn a lot about organizing and community from black women. They've been really good at organizing and doing it largely on their own without the support of the majority. So if they can do it, imagine what they can teach us about organizing. But again, we can't rely on them to teach us everything. They figured it out on their own. So we can too. Let's study Black women's history. Let's study the women who have been organizers, the Ida B. Wells and the Shirley Chisolms and the Maxine Waters and the Corrine Browns and the Stacey Abrams and the Jasmine Crockett's. We need to study them. We need to learn from them. And I think most importantly, as a closing, I want to say we need to do this together. Now more than ever, we need to come together and fight together. I don't think any of us are going to win doing this alone. People are going to lose rights. People are going to get hurt. People are going to die. So we all need to stand together. And white women, you need to show up. All right. That's how I see it. Let me know if this was helpful. If you have any thoughts or suggestions, feel free to leave them below. And Black women, I want to thank you for having the courage to stand in your truth, to tell us how you're feeling. I hope this video inspires us all, white women, to take action, to be better allies and better advocates. And again, there's going to be a lot of resources in the video description below, and I will see you next time. Thanks for listening.